Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from, and a very warm welcome to this panel on Future Fit Leaders Enabling a Fluid Workforce. One of the things, while there's been lingering uncertainty about 2021, I think organizations are in a better position to reinvent themselves, keeping people first strategy, and also looking at, while it's digital to the fore, how do we stay human to the core? We have an exciting lineup of panelists, all dialing in from different parts of the world, as all of you are as participants. I just want to throw in a few quick housekeeping rules before we jump in. Please officially register for the event. The link is there in the chat. You can download the event guide and it has all the information. You will also get the activity codes for the recreditation credits, recertification credits. It'll pop up in the chat magically a couple of times. So please save those codes. And lastly, we are on webinar mode. Please feel free to interact with the panelists and among yourselves in the chat. We will have time for Q&A towards the end of the session. Do keep the questions coming, but request you to use the Q&A option. We know that the chats will be buzzing, so we might just miss the questions there. So let's jump right in. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Amy Anger, Vice President and General Counsel at Stefanini, NA. Chris Brown, Interim VP of People at UpVest. Chris Havrilla, Vice President, HR Technology and Solution Provider Strategy at Deloitte Consulting.
Everyone.
Donna Scarola, Global Head, Performance and Leadership Model, Johnson & Johnson, and Adjunct Professor at NYU.
Hello.
And Susan Lovegren, EVP, Chief People Officer, Board Member, HR Technology Board Advisor, and many more roles that she plays.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Thank you all so much. And I just want to get us all warmed up by asking each of you about the one trend that you're excited about for 2021. So if we can start with you, Amy.
Sure. Yeah, the that I'm the most excited about is I think we'll now finally be over talking about whether remote work is something that we can actually do. The pandemic forced us all to figure it out. We didn't think they could.
Christopher, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So the topic I think it's nervous, excited about is one around communication. And now that we're still mostly working remote, how do we actually deal with all of the noise from all the different channels and help our people kind of cut through that and focus on what it is they need to be doing?
Chris?
Even before, when we talked before, I think mine's even switched. We just published our 2021 Human Capital Trends. And one of the things I was the most excited about, because it leads into a body of work that I'm doing this year, is this notion of reimagining work. Prior to COVID, most executives were thinking more about optimizing work and maybe redesigning work. And now the numbers skyrocketed post, the crisis and the pandemic, and it was 29% prior to it in our 2020 trends, and in 2021 it was 61%, which I think is phenomenal, because is the notion of reimagining work and re-architecting work means so much for all of us who have to do the work, right? And the synchronization of work, workforce, workplace as part of it. So I am the most excited about that, because I think the pain was high enough that people are really thinking about change in a whole other way.
Great. What about you, Donna? What are you excited about?
So I don't think I can pick just one, but my top two are probably talent marketplaces and team performance. I think organizations historically have just been so focused on the individual, from a development lens or a promotion lens or a performance lens, and we're realizing work, it requires collaboration and teams. So really, really liking that.
And Susan?
That leaves me. So I'm super excited about all of the innovation that has occurred over the last year, and in particular in the HR technology space. So, obviously we've had a lot of things occur over the last 12 to 15 months that actually has wound up accelerating the level of innovation in which work gets done in the future. So we've talked a lot about the future of work, about reimagining work, about thinking about work differently in more of a transformative way. But now I believe we're seeing the tools, the platforms, the software now coming online that actually allows us to realize that vision. So I'm super excited about all the creativity and innovation I've seen play out in the last 12 months.
That's fantastic setting up for us to get deeper into the conversation. So I do want to dive in and, maybe let me start with you, Chris. In our conversations, you mentioned about enduring human capabilities. So what are organizations doing to create that right messaging surrounding being human and empathetic while we are all going digital?
It's kind of fascinating. When we first started studying, this notion of enduring human capabilities, it was because everybody kept talking about reskilling, right? We've got to reskill our organizations, and there was all this pressure to do it. And one of the things that we had found in our data was, look, this, with skills, the average shelf life of the skill is it was 2.5 to 4 years. It's even gone down from that, and you can't reskill at scale. So why don't we focus kind of a little bit more on what's important? And you keep seeing this in other ways where people were like, we need people who have more imagination and empathy and resilience, and then the resilience thing accelerated, even in all this. And so one of the things that we're seeing that I think is really, important is that companies are starting to shift that focus, or at least considering shifting the focus to how do we start developing, even the capabilities that are innate, but that can be amplified, and then the ones that can continue to be developed through experience and practice. And, empathy and resilience, both kind of fall in that innate category. But, one of the things is, we're seeing is, okay, now if we're going to focus on developing these things so that people can just learn in the flow at an easier pace, but also how can we actually start to recognize these things? Even seeing where, companies are using their recognition platforms and things like that to say, let's celebrate empathy this week. Who can you do a shout out, a recognition, a bravo, all the different ways that people are doing it. Same thing around that, but also holding people more and more accountable to those things. So when we're trying to measure things like experience and engagement, that we're measuring those things, asking about those things, giving people development and feedback on those things, as opposed to some of the harder or more tangible things, but just starting to bring this more into the discussion, right? So we're seeing it from a lot of different aspects. How do we develop it? How do we recognize it? How do we actually give feedback and coaching and nudging on it?
That's great, putting soft skills, so-called soft skills,
Right.
back to where they belong.
Yeah.
So, Susan, if I can, just ask you, you work with a whole host of organizations in the HR tech space. And you already mentioned about how tech is in HR is transforming employee experience. So would love to hear from you some examples of what's working and what's going on there in that space.
Yeah, sure. Gosh, I think there's so many things going on, but one of the things that really came to light with the pandemic is the recognition that all people are not created equal, meaning they don't all need the same things. They all have different needs. They have different life situations. And I think for the first time, there's almost this forced situation with everybody on Zoom as an example. There was suddenly a realization that, hey, we've got people with different generational needs, different needs at home. They're taking care of maybe parents or children, or maybe they're living with roommates in an apartment and they need different things related to their space. So I think from a technology perspective, we now can understand and sort of begin to parse out through things like real-time feedback systems, getting information about how things are going measuring those signals, if you will, right away through many of the platforms that look at what type of employee experience somebody is having. And our ability to respond to that really accelerates. So as HR practitioners, we have information all of a sudden that we can close the loop on, we can be smarter about, we can begin to track analytics and really understand what those different needs are of our workforce. So when I look at HR technology, there's many platforms that take care of a piece of that employee journey, if you will. But I think over time, we'll probably see many of these solutions come together in a way that provides a more fluid solution on the employee experience front. And so the pandemic, in my mind, has really forced that and put it more front and center, because we're getting that feedback much quicker. We have people who are dispersed. They weren't dispersed as much before. They're not coming into an office as regularly. And, understanding your workforce has become much more important, and keeping track of where people are at, what their level of engagement is, what are their needs. So from my perspective, whether it's in the wellness space, or it's in looking at setting goals and objectives, or just really understanding, how psychologically safe people are, how, they're responding to things related to harassment or microaggressions or whatever they might be. Those needs are still, they're coming out, but we need different methods, if you will, to understand where everybody is at. So that's that convergence, if you will, between kind of the old world and the new world. And I think over time, with the information and as technology improves, hopefully it will raise the IQ of practitioners, if you will, so we can for our really important workforce.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about, what is said about we're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And I can see somebody, Alfred, in the chat also saying that we're all at different levels at Maslow's hierarchy as well. So our needs are different about where we are. So thank you, Susan. I just want to move on to the trend side and to you, Amy. What have organizations learned in this transition over the last year or so, year and a half? What are some of the trends that we are now bringing back to the office and the workspace as well?
Yeah, so one of the pieces that will definitely come back, we go back to the office, is the lack of the one, and that we can bring people back in a manner and think about who really needs to get their work done in the office. And do they really need to be in the office all 5 days? Or can we go to some modified type of schedule? So the flexibility, the increased flexibility is now something that we will definitely be bringing back to the office in our operations.
No, I think we're all looking forward to that flexibility now. That's become taken for granted kind of thing, the other side. Yeah. So Donna, you work on—
That's right, yeah.
You work on shaping ideas around talent marketplaces, team-based performance. That's your, niche area, and which probably suits the current realities. So please help us understand what is HR's role in shaping some of these.
Yeah. So actually kind of building off of what Chris was saying, I think over the last year, especially, and even when I talk to my students, there's kind of this theme that has been coming up for me and my team, which is that, organizations are like organisms, and teams are just various systems, right? It's like a body. And if one system is off, the whole organization is a bit off. And so for us, the more and more I think about where does HR play and where, what is our role, a lot of it is really diagnosing the work, how it's getting done. And really, again, when I'm thinking about like team performance, it's not hierarchy. It's not who reports to who. It's who needs to come together, very much like a Scrum team in Agile, who needs to come together to address an end-to-end problem or an end-to-end service for a customer, whether that be internal or external. So I guess for me, it's like HR kind of plays three roles. It's like being able to diagnose, right? Like where are the problems and how is the system operating? And that's kind of the back end work. If I just think of it like front end and back end, it's not the talent, it's the work. Then it's a bit of who's the right talent to do that work, matching those skills, getting more into the behavioral science. And then lastly, it's how do we scale that? And that's where, like, you know, my digital partners come in. I used to kind of play that role, but really being those product owners and scaling those experiences, or those, I hate the word process, but like those processes at scale, right? That design, so it can replicate, right? Especially in larger enterprises. So I feel like it's kind of, it doesn't always have to, one person doesn't need to play those three roles, but HR needs to play those three roles pretty well.
Totally has brought HR to the table on that, for sure. And I think this nicely segues to the work that you do, Christopher, you know, in terms of creating opportunities to relook at the whole gig economy in a whole new way. So as you're experiencing it, how are freelancers and hence the gig economy really reshaping itself? What's working well?
Yeah, so I think the gig economy, it feels like it's really kind of catching momentum now. It was already catching momentum before. And how I see it, I can also talk about my personal experience with this, which is coming out of a position leading a people team after a pretty intense period through COVID. I was also feeling a bit kind of burned by it all and thinking, okay, but what do I actually want from the next thing that I'm doing? And what can I do in a position that I'm in at the moment? And what would that look like for actually how I want to live my life? So that's how I took the step into the gig economy. And that's how I can see other people doing it as well, which is where people have got the opportunity to be able to have more flexibility, more freedom, more choice, more options in their own future. Then I think it's a huge step forward. But with it though, I also see this other kind of, it's kind of like a gift and a curse in some sense as well. If I'm in a position where I'm freelancing and also looking for people to join the team, now that there are actually more people working in the gig economy, for example, if I'm trying to find a recruiter now, a full-time recruiter, it's much tougher because more people are freelancing. And therefore, more people are looking for these people. And so actually, where you thought tech recruiters were a premium before, or some kind of recruiters, for an example, the desire has gone up even more now. So I definitely see challenges with it. But yeah, it also presents many opportunities. And also talking from my experience, I can wholeheartedly recommend it so far.
Great. So just, you know, we were talking more on a macro level. I think just on an individual level for each of you, and I'd love to hear more about your personal experiences. How has your leadership role in enabling this fluid workforce really worked? What are some of the challenges that you faced when you looked at workarounds in the organization? So I would love to hear your individual experiences on that. And Christopher, because you were talking about, you know, your personal experiences, maybe would you like to get started first?
Sure. Yeah, so in my role, I work with various founders from around about Series A upwards size companies or stage companies. And in my role, the way I see it is I can complement kind of the skill sets that they have when it comes to how they're thinking about the businesses and how they're thinking about the future of the business and how they're thinking about other topics with the people element of it. So making sure that when we're talking about doing these certain things as a business, like how do you also bring the people along with that? And I definitely see that some founders really get where they need to be at and thinking at this level now at this stage. For an example, in my last client, they took a conscious decision at the start of the pandemic to say, you know what, we realize that if we want to be a step ahead of the competition, if we want to give ourselves a competitive advantage, we need to go fully distributed. We'll figure everything out as we go along. And actually, that's kind of when I joined a little bit later and we did figure things out. You know, we're working with companies who can be our employee of record in different geographies. So then that opens up the talent pool for us. But then there are other people that we work with who maybe don't have that natural way of thinking, and they're also very attached to the office space as well. So how do you kind of facilitate that? Well, we need to do this, but move you away from that in a way which isn't going to shatter you as a whole, as a person so quickly. So it really depends. It's very interesting who you work with, but I don't think there's any doubt that the companies who are thinking about the future, thinking about how they can really focus on having a fluid workforce are the ones that will have a competitive advantage.
Totally. Donna, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm always searching for the unmute button. And so, I mean, I think last year was like a pivotal year for anyone in our space, and there's a few kind of things that I thought about a lot, and we kind of experimented with just doing like employee sentiment and interviews and kind of design thinking sessions. But a few things came up for me as we think about moving towards the future of not only work, but I see performance really more as a business experience and process, not an HR one, because it should just enable, right, performance. And so a few things came up, which is that people really didn't feel, and we learned this very quickly, that they had the autonomy and kind of power, if you will, as employees to shape their workload or how to prioritize. And that was like a big body of work last year of us kind of pushing agility in performance and helping also even managers think about like their team and that it's not just about their individual employees and their development or their performance. The kind of second, I think, is, and this is just even to fellow HR practitioners, I think we're often stuck in using a lot of historical performance processes to differentiate talent, to justify compensation, as opposed to actually enabling performance and driving performance. And so that's been a big body of work of really thinking through that. And especially as we're experimenting in predominantly behavioral experiments, but around team-based performance, we're kind of realizing it's hard for people to even think of performance to drive performance, right? On teams, it's all about what's in it for me, because we're so used to individual, and this really came out of the Industrial Revolution. And so we've gone through the intellectual revolution, if you will, and now we're in a whole new space, right? Even kind of what Chris is talking about, where jobs and roles, we know that inside of organizations, when we talk about talent marketplaces, it's just a reflection of the external market, right? There's a lot of freelancers, gig work. And so that flexibility and fluidity is challenging us to even realize the structure and design that we've built that doesn't really fit. And so I'm obviously giving an example of performance, but it's forcing us to think about all of the things, right? Like, why do we measure and differentiate talent on a scale of good to bad, as opposed to how about we bucket them by strengths, right? Just like in school, where I wasn't so good at history, but I was strong in math and science. And so for me, it's like, I still, went on to university and all of those things, but at work, it's like, we're very focused just on like, is someone good to bad? Are they a good performer? Are they high potential? And I think data and kind of technology is allowing us to look at things a lot more differently. So quite a few things that we're thinking about.
In fact, if I can just bring up one of the questions, and maybe, you can. So one question that's being asked is about, as positions go more and more remote, will this affect the pay ranges for the position? So by being at home, there is less gas mileage and other factors. So it's a lifestyle change. So is it possible that pay could decrease? Donna, any thoughts on that? Is this?
I mean, I'll give you my perspective. I can't represent my organization, but I don't think we pay work for skills and output, right? And impact. We don't pay work for how many, at least most jobs, I should say, especially most jobs in the organizations that, like I benchmark with or that I've worked in. You're not doing productivity. You're not doing hours clocking in and clocking out. So why would we then measure by that someone has to drive somewhere, as opposed to the impact it is on the business? I haven't seen a lot of organizations talk about that. I think it's more, why are we even keeping regular schedules? Like, I think we're really starting to think about, how do we measure work? I think we've been measuring productivity for so long, and we realize that we're measuring one thing, expecting another, right? So I don't know if that gets at it, but no, I'm definitely not thinking about that. I think that's the opposite direction we want to go in, because that becomes much more a babysitter approach. And it's quite the opposite of, I know I've worked far more hours this year, and I used to have a 2-hour commute round trip. So for me, I don't see how, how we would reduce pay. I can't imagine a world in which we go in that direction, but I'd love to hear other thoughts.
I'd love to weigh in just even on the leadership thing, as well, right? Because I think a lot of this is all tying together, and I'm grateful that you even talked about the notion of work. I mean, when we did our high impact workforce study last year, we ended up having to change the name of it 2 times, before we published, and what we realized, the biggest finding that we had was that there was going to have to be this synchronization between, kind of moving beyond talent, right? Even the notion of talent management is changing. We started calling it workforce architecture, and then we realized the biggest finding out of this was moving beyond managing talent to systemically and simultaneously synchronizing, right? Workforce, workplace. So you raise that notion of work, and I do think there is kind of an evolution of productivity beyond where we've come, which is why I was so excited about the trend around reimagining work, because we're thinking about it in different ways, and where we've focused in the past really probably was on output, right, and revenue and profit and products, and we're moving to this notion of focusing on outcomes. And I think the pay will kind of go along with that. Like everything will start to go along with that. But I think, focusing on outcomes, is where we're going. And I love that you said earlier, Donna, that you hate the word process, because I do too. And work is becoming more than a set of activities, right? It's more than tasks and outputs. It's how people are interacting and creating and learning and growing and teaming and innovating to produce value-based outcomes. So I think, I hate the word process because it represents all that kind of routine and flexible, repetitive, linear, whatever you want to call it, stuff that really wasn't necessarily happening. So as a leader, in my organization, and what we're even studying is this notion of flow, right? That it's not input, process, output, that it is, questions or triggers or events or whatever, right? And then there's a series of outcomes that you're trying to get to. And what's left in the middle is flow, right? And that's the how. And I think focusing people on what, is giving them what the outcomes are, why, connecting them to the work and getting out of their way and letting them figure out the how, right? Because that is flow. It's non-routine. It's increasingly work group oriented. And it's fluid. The work is fluid too. It's not just the workforce. So, that notion of being fluid rather than predetermined and focusing on creating value, I think is where we're going, right? So it is connected. Work is important. Workforce is important. Workplace is important, and it's got to be synchronized and it's got to flow. Right? It's all fluid. And if we haven't learned that in the last year, I don't know if we ever will. Right?
I love it.
I'll add a comment or two. So the question is really around, I think, around regional pay, and are companies going to adjust for regional differences? And historically, if you look at, why companies did that, it was based on cost of living in certain geographies. So if you were in the Bay Area or, New York City, where the cost of living was, at a certain premium, the pay differential would be, slightly more for somebody living in New York City versus somebody living maybe in the Midwest. So, I haven't seen a mass effort of everybody turning around and now adjusting to regional pay if somebody's moved from the Bay Area to Austin. Although some companies, I do believe, are starting to make those changes, those adjustments. And I believe that has more to do with internal, it's probably more based on two internal factors. One, perception around fairness, that, hey, if I'm in the Bay Area and I have a higher cost of living, and somebody's living in some other part of the country, they're essentially having a better lifestyle than me. So therefore, what are you going to do for me in the Bay Area then to adjust for that? So you start getting into some of these interesting dynamics, within sort of the internal piece of it. The other piece that, and I agree, it's not, your parents' workforce anymore, and it's a supply and demand issue. And I think that's really, those basic economics are going to drive how people are paid regardless. So I definitely think that's going to, drive a lot of it. But you also have the sheer economics of a company where, let's say, if you want to pay everybody the same, or, all of a sudden people can work wherever they want, and you're going to basically give them whatever, roughly the same rate. You, again, from a pure financial perspective, that may not fit with your model. That may not be financially possible for a company to do that. So let's say you put everybody globally on the same pay scale. And I'm being a little bit of a contrarian here. If you put everybody on the same pay scale, you might not be able to afford to stay in business. So, again, I think companies are going to take a period of time as we migrate towards, really reimagining pay, which I think we should. I think there's a lot of opportunities to be much more transparent and much more equitable with pay. And I think that's coming. But I do think there's this transition period where, again, companies financially, they are not, it's not in their model to all of a sudden, put everybody on a completely different pay scale. So there's a sort of a practical piece to it, and an internal, I call it more of an internal fairness is how I would categorize it. It has to be managed. But all that being said, it gets down to supply and demand. I've worked for many large global companies, and if you have the right talent, believe me, it doesn't matter where they are, we will pay to get them and put them in our company. So, it kind of works both ways, but I would be remiss not to sort of, highlight the transitional period I think that we're in, and just the very real conversations that are happening at the executive, level, in terms of how do they navigate.
Well, the sheer economics are important, right? But equity is at the center of this, whether it's geo, whether it's gender, whether it's culture. I mean, it's going to be at the center, and it's out of their hands. So they've got to start to figure out a way to address that as an equity.
I think it's transitional for them. I think it's it's a period of figuring out how are they going to migrate towards it. It's sort of accelerated all of the issues I think that people in HR have been pushing for a lot of years. So I do think it's going to be reimagined, and it's certainly going to happen sooner. But that being said, I think companies are grappling with some real challenges in how to do that, and that's our job to help.
We sort of lost Amy along the way. I think she's having some internet issues. But if I can just stay with you, Susan, for just asking you about your specific leadership challenges while you were working around this fluid workforce.
That goes actually a little bit to what we were just talking about. And I think one of the challenges early on last year was this issue of leaders being tone deaf. And it's an interesting flip, if you will. I think for many years, HR people have been very clear on these things, that these trends and what was happening, and doing a very good job of expressing these issues to their executive team, especially those in those CHRO roles, very courageous individuals talking about these challenges. Pandemic hits, and again, leaders, their first reaction is to try to maintain control of the workforce, which you're never going to control your workforce. That ship has sailed. And so it's this idea of, well, I've got to control the work from home policy. So we're going to really focus on work from home and then return to work. And a lot of these sort of bureaucratic policy related things is initially where people went in leadership roles. And so a leadership challenge has been like, whoa, don't be tone deaf. First thing we need to do is lead with empathy and understand, like, what is going on for people? What is really happening in their world? What are their challenges? How do we help them to be successful? What is it that they need? And rather than, assuming that we know what it is that people need to be successful, asking, listening differently. So I think the challenge for leadership in general is to listen differently, to be empathetic, to recognize that we need to really rely on the wisdom of the crowd, so to speak. So it's, I think that those are some of the big challenges I've seen over the last year or so.
Yeah, welcome back, Amy. And we were just talking about your leadership role in enabling a fluid workforce, some of the challenges and workarounds that you've seen in your organization. And so if you could just share with us what's been your
Sure.
experience.
Well, one of the challenges is right there. One of the challenges is right there. Everybody's their own tech support, right? And for me, I started with my current company literally 2 weeks before shutdown happened here in our portion of the States. So being a new employee, I really have now a different view of what it takes when you bring someone on in this remote world, because it's much harder for me to make those connections in a new workplace. And normally I would know where to get some things done by a year in, and I'm still having to go to certain people because I don't exactly know who's who. So that's now changed the way I would onboard someone and think about how to give them the resources and give them more kind of self-help abilities and create the tools that would be available, because when they're sitting at home, it's not as easy as walking to your neighbor's office or desk and saying, where do I go to get XYZ, or how do I get something done? So it put a different lens on it for me.
Yeah. In fact, there's a question for you on the Q&A from Elizabeth Stoneburner, asking, do you think the trends will be that organizations create a hybrid approach with a mix of in-office and remote work, or perhaps take it a step further and shutter offices to move to 100% remote? And do you see any negative consequences of 100% remote? I'm sure all of you have views on it. It was addressed to you, Amy.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer, but I'd like, everybody else's input on this too. So even pre-pandemic, there were companies that were already 100% remote and had gone with that model. I think for those of us who already have locations, my guess is that hybrid will probably win the day, because there are some positions that just are really done better in person, even, if not all of the time, a majority of the time. And for me, I really miss being in control of when I got to be remote, because I miss connecting with people in person. And there's just something about that in-person connection that you obviously can't make in the remote situation. I think there's always a balance. I think there's positives and negatives to every situation. And it's just, how do you then adjust your workplace rules and your workplace norms to deal with the balance, and making sure you strike the right balance of the positives for your workforce.
Yeah. No easy answers there for sure.
Right.
Chris, staying with you on the whole leadership process and challenges and how it's been for your organization. So could you share some examples of what's happened with work there at Deloitte?
And that's really what I was touching on earlier. It's that move and that shift to outcomes, versus output, and understanding that, this isn't going to be about process, right? And really just, refocusing people on what and why, and connecting them to that work, and, and look, where we have to reimagine work, that's what we have to do. I loved, even what Amy was saying earlier, and it's, again, it's why getting to work and outcomes is so important, even if it has to be re-architected. If we're looking at synchronizing workforce, workplace, right? We need to understand what the work is and the outcomes. We need to understand those outcomes more than anything, so that people can shift. We can figure out what has to be done in an office, what can be done elsewhere, and by who it can be done, right? To the fluidity of the workforce. But that synchronization is so important, and we're trying to lead by example with that. I think for a company like Deloitte, it's easy. We're not creating a widget over, we're, our people are our product, right? And we we can ebb and flow, but we still, what are we doing for our clients? How are we helping them? What are the outcomes? Connecting people to that, and then figuring out what do people need to make decisions, take action, right? That's what's in the middle of all of that. And, and understanding what those things are, where, how, all of that kind of falls into place, right? But if you stay firmly, ensconced in what those outcomes are, giving people and empowering people where you can on the how, right, is, I think critical part of what the researchers were showing, but what we're also, doing and having to do to lead people through this.
I want to just take in a couple of questions, one for Christopher. And of course, everybody, please feel free to, jump in. So this is from Victoria, asking, can you perhaps speak on how your companies or your clients are reimagining their real estate footprint and designs to enable performance and engagement in the future of work? Is this something you want to talk about, Christopher?
I mean, as I talked about before, how one of the clients is reimagining it was getting rid of it by completely saying, that's it, it's gone. I mean, so we're still in a bit of a state at the minute where the office is still there, and we've also gone through the phase of two companies I've worked at now, where just before the pandemic they went and had more space in the office, and now they've got this dilemma of, okay, so now we've got this space. What are we actually going to use it for? We're talking about the hybrid model as well. How do you make it so there is enough space for people to come in and be creative, like co-create and work on the projects? It's the same with everything else we've talked about. There is no kind of one silver bullet for what we're doing here at the moment, because the businesses, the cultures are so different, and how you kind of bring people together and foster this, I don't know, like this, how we were before the pandemic to where we are now, isn't just a case of adding on a little bit here and doing a little bit there. I think you read up about everything we're doing with remote. It's almost very much worth actually wiping the slate clean, even when it comes to the hybrid model, and saying, okay, now we're here, actually, how are we going to make all of this work in a fluid way? What does the office look like? How are we going to onboard people when we've got people who are working here and we've got people working here? Do we fly people in? Do we not fly people in? Do we do video? How do you maintain that same experience that you have? This is such a challenge, such a fascinating challenge. And it's not going to go away anytime soon, but definitely the workspace, however people are thinking about it, is going to be one that's going to need to be fluid, as we're talking about here, which is going to need to adapt and change as we change our approach to the hybrid model.
I have a couple of questions again. I know we're taking the questions in ahead because great questions, all segueing to the conversations we're having. So one for Donna, and then I'll go to Susan and Chris for a longish but a very relevant question. So Donna, yours, how do you recommend the organization of performance to grant autonomy, but ensure it still aligns? For example, if one team has a different priority than another team, but there are initiatives that are dependent on both teams, how do you achieve that alignment that enables efficiency?
I think my response to that, usually when I talk to various leaders, is you have the wrong teams, meaning the organizational structure is incorrect. So I'll give an example. I grew up in software, so I grew up building HR software. And I was a product manager, and working with many engineering teams at a time, we never had dependencies except for maybe like code pushes. And I'll explain why, is because we were tackling different customer pain points at once in parallel. And I think that's the way, as Chris was saying, like, as we really reimagine work, and I'll give an example, we went through a transformation where now we're aligned to audience. So our personas in HR, we're not aligned by like business structure in the talent space and global talent. And it was a very mindful decision because, the needs of our senior leaders are very different than an early in career talent. So I guess, if there is a dependency, it should be like an infrastructure question, like, are we using the same HRIS? But beyond that, in my solution to that is always transparency. Like, I think HR needs to get better at using roadmaps, like stand-ups, like all of those technologies that a lot of other industries in automotive and tech have been using for a long time. It makes it hard to run into each other and realize you're working on the wrong things, because it's kind of always been there all along. So it's kind of my advice, and that's the way we operate, which I enjoy very much.
No, thanks. So there's a question from Simon, and this I think covers both you, Chris and Susan. So this aspect of diverse needs that Susan mentioned is very interesting. It echoes what Chris mentioned about the need to cut the noise. But developing our ability to focus, cut through the noise, adapt to change, to have more resilience, to show empathy or shift perspective, to allow greater work collaboration and finding solutions has to come with a focus on developing the soft skills of being self-aware. To your point on what you were talking about, the soft skill, having the inner core to stay present in face of challenge. So how is this new level of presence possible with our current way of responding to stress?
I guess I'll start that with a math.
That is a good one.
Massive question.
Maybe I'll break it up into a couple of segments. So first of all, I do think, and I'm going to go back to technology, not that technology is a be all and end all, it's a tool, but I do think the tools around gathering information have improved significantly. And listen, it doesn't matter what you use, as long as you use something that works for you in terms of being able to understand what is the real-time situation in your workforce, real-time feedback. You can pulse people on a regular basis. You can look at different analytics to understand who's talking to who, what the dynamics are in your organization. There are many things you can do to gain insights about your workforce, and I do think this is a fairly significant shift that is occurring. It's a trend, and I don't think it's going away. So if you equate it to the customer experience space along with employee experience, companies hands down understand everything about their customers. They are understanding pretty much every move their customers make, feedback all the time, constantly looking for ways to make improvements, to respond to the market, to make sure that they are on point 24/7. It's really the same thing that's occurring for the employee experience, for the employee side of the house. So it's looking at these tools and resources, if you will, for gaining that information to become smarter, to make better decisions, to be able to respond to those differences. So as an example, some people are thinking this work from home thing is really great. I don't have to commute. I have more flexibility with my family. I'm more relaxed. I can exercise when I feel like it. I can do my yoga class in my den. This is awesome. There are other people who might be, I'll take my San Francisco people in millennials working maybe 5-7 years into their career. They are shoehorned into an apartment with 4 or 6 people, hardly any light, any windows, really no place to go and do their work. They're all there, coding, trying to, concentrate, or they might be on leading a sales team and having to be more animated. So for that particular part of your workforce, it's really difficult. It's really challenging. So they would need a different type of solution. And interestingly enough, there are these new solutions coming out in the workplace services area around space where, much like an Airbnb, you can go rent office space for the day. You can go drop in someplace. You can buy subscriptions. So it's opened up, all kinds of ways. And you can do that in small groups. You can do it alone. You can do it in a clean and safe environment. So that would be an example. Somebody maybe in that situation would need a different type of solution versus somebody who would want the wellness program so they can do the exercise at home where they have space. So it's maybe you're making different choices or offering up different solutions. So I think there's a lot of ways you can gain those insights, and that's why tech is so important for us, because we're not going to have the water cooler talk to say, hey, how's it really going for you right now? We need a quicker, more efficient way of really understanding and getting those insights. And, responding to it is how we're going to build the trust in our workplaces and responding well to the information we get. That trust factor is going to really be critical going forward in everything that we do. So I think those are some of the ways of thinking about it. I could talk for a long time about how to, do segmentation and so forth, but I think I think those are some of the things that we just need to be much more mindful of. Is really those different things that are going on. Needs for connection around things like employee resource groups. Those needs have not gone away. People still want to connect. They still want to belong. They still want the psychological safety. We just have to think very differently about how are we going to create that experience for them in this new world of work. And and whether it's hybrid, whether it's home all the time, whether it's people dispersed regionally, these human needs are not going to go away. The way we respond to them must change, and we must be more sensitive and empathetic to the fact that we do have these different needs. And I'll turn it to Chris Brown to chime in on that very long question.
Yeah.
Oh, you answered it really nicely. Some really great points in there, actually. I think this is such a really interesting topic at the moment, just because of where we all are and this working from home. Like, I think I've said this so many times. Again, I'm just a personal situation here. Like, I'm in my bedroom at the minute. I spend probably 20 hours a day in my bedroom, and my wife will say to me sometimes, "Oh, let's have an early night tonight." And I'm like, "Don't make me go back in that bedroom." No, like, I want to keep out of it. And it's finding these boundaries in our work, in our lives at the moment, that, yeah, I think when we go back into, when things are open a bit more and we've got some more social spaces where we can come together, I think that's fine. But I still see some underlying issues in it. This is kind of not unique to where we all are, but the modern way we live of always being connected, always having like the phone with us, the email ping, the notification pings. And actually, how do we get back to giving people the space to think, like, clearly, like the deep thinking that we're good at? And I'm not sure what we're going to change it, because it's so deep rooted in how we all work now, with email and with notifications and everything else. And also something else I did the other day, I switched off the notification on WhatsApp. I'm like, oh my God, why did I not do this before? Because I would sit here trying to concentrate and be bzz, 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 and I'd be like, okay, yeah, look at it, and my focus is gone. And yeah, this is just, I think over the last few weeks and months, it's something personally for myself. I've been thinking, how can I help others like move towards this direction of having this clarity and having this space to think and having these more personal interactions? I don't know what the answer is here. It's going to take a big team effort.
Thank you so much. And I think this is something we see with our work with clients on change management, on all these connections, and being more present and being more mindful when we are in the online space. How do we really build our connections working this way? So thank you so much. It's been a great discussion. I know the chats are buzzing. I know there are a lot more questions, but I want to just go around and take a quick closing remark from each of you, just a line or so. And if we still have time, then we'll take one more question. Amy, do you want to get started?
Sure. I think the main key for everyone is that none of us have it figured out. So just be willing to try a bunch of different things to see what works, and give people the space and your team the opportunity to raise issues and to try different things and give them a shot, because you just don't know what might work for someone or what might work for a particular situation.
Susan, just quick closing remarks. Yeah.
Time of great innovation, creativity, and focus on taking care of yourself. I think HR has been on the front lines this year, will continue to be so, and I think in a great way. I think there's been a recognition of the value that the function brings and the necessity, for the skill set all of you have. So, congratulations to all of you for making it through the year, but make sure you practice some self-care, and again, keep innovating. I think this is going to be a great time of creativity going forward. So thank you.
Yeah. Donna?
I think for me, it's probably when you're thinking about bettering the employee experience and questioning the godforsaken word process, like question the structure around it and whether you're asking the right question of how do I make this better, and just how can I completely, you know, as Chris was mentioned, like reimagine everything around us, because this is the time.
Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. What I would say as well is to all of this is like really remember that doing what you're doing, you're not alone. And if you do feel that you're alone, then find yourself a network. You might not think you can find yourself a network to do it, but you will be able to. You just look around you and ask people and start to build a network of peers and people that you can trust and build relationships with, and have these kind of chats that we're having here now, and attend these kind of conferences that we're doing now, because this is where all the richness of the learning comes from talking with others, bouncing ideas off, and just getting some inspiration and believing in what you're doing as well.
Great. And Chris.
Yeah, I'll re-echo, because I'm super excited about this notion of re-architecting and reimagining work, that's coming. And part of that equation is technology. Look, if we're going to fundamentally work in different ways and achieve outcomes that we've never achieved before, it is going to be, how we use technology, how we apply technology. So, and Susan was spot on in a lot of that, but I loved one of the questions, even in the chat, and I'll throw a link out there, because, going back to that notion of enduring human capabilities and how do we continually develop those things. And as the demands increase for the entire workforce to demonstrate higher proficiencies in these areas, again, even if it's just empathy or resilience or curiosity, the different ways of thinking that we need to do, companies are looking for super effective learning solutions to develop those things, and they can actually be delivered very cost effectively and flexibly to workers by doing immersive learning. And so I think it was Bob that brought up, VR and AR and and XR, and I do think it's super important because of all the opportunity to kind of offer leveraging these types of technologies to compress the learning time. I mentioned it earlier in my talk, but it does, and because of the immersive nature of it, you can learn these things, practice these things, develop these things, empathy even, in a really safe space, in a really compressed time, and in a really immersive way. And those technologies offer very, very promising opportunity, and we're starting to study that even more and more. So I'll throw a link in the chat to a good article that that we published at one point, but that we are kind of furthering in our research. So a lot ahead with it.
I think that's a nice way. I think the fact that this conference itself has been able to be organized this way across all countries, time zones, places, which may not have been possible before. So special thanks to Enrique Rubio and his team for an amazing job in putting this conference together. We are on time, so thank you all so much for being part of this discussion. And special thanks to all of you, Amy, Christopher, Chris, Donna, and Susan. We've had a great time interacting in the run up to the conference as well. So thank you for your time. And I've made my notes, and I'm sure all of us are eager to see how this shapes up this year and beyond.